All right, so hello and welcome to our fifth video in this series for Donna Downey Studios and the Artist Gang blog. I wanted to try out an acrylic pour like look using my oil pastels because after the first 4 videos I have realized that heat really affects the oil pastels, and I thought that if I laid it on thick enough I might be able to sort of melt it and let it run similar to wax and even more similar to the look of an acrylic pour. So that's where they take and they add like silicone and a Floetrol and whatever else, and they like mix it in with their acrylics, and then they pour their acrylics into 1 cup, and then they dump the cup on top of a piece of whatever. I mean, it could be a canvas, etc. And then they let the colors sort of seep out and move around, and then it creates cells. So that silicone and that Floetrol and stuff, it creates cells. So I was thinking that I might be able to do something similar if I started with the basic color that I wanted for the tag just on the bottom layer, and I added the oil pastel really thick, and then I added heat and it got to move around, and then if I let it cool and I added some more of other colors on top of the pastel, and then I let those heat, I thought that I might come up with the same sort of look as an acrylic pour. I thought that. That is not what happens. However, the technique is still kind of cool what does happen. So you can see I'm layering on really thickly, some dark green, some medium green. I bring in a bit of yellow, like a greenish yellow, and then a bit more golden color. And I just keep the colors in the same value, like green feeds into yellow rather than having like the light green, the dark green, and then the yellow. I have the dark green, the light green, and then the yellow because that's how the colors would work together. So I tried that out, and I was working in this area and nothing was melting. Nothing was happening. It was all really just staying where it was. So since the tag was hot already, I thought that I would add in some more oil pastel now, because since the tag is warm, the oil pastel really seems to be sort of like melting onto the tag rather than scribbling like a crayon. So at this point, I thought, okay, we're getting somewhere now. Now it's going to do what I want. That's still not true. I don't know why. I'm not sure. And totally, if there's some oil pastel artists out there, maybe you could give me some tips. Maybe I should have put some oil down or something like that. I just thought that when I heated it, the oil pastels would get very fluid and move around like wax does. But they didn't. That's not what they did. Then at this point, I thought, well, maybe it's because my heat gun doesn't have enough power, because it's one of the quiet Ranger ones. And I thought, well, that's okay if it's not working because of that. But let me see what happens if I get out a tool. So I used this Dina Wakley tool. It's a silicone kind of like brush, but it has wedges on the end, and it's really cool for making marks in wet paint. And I thought, well, let me see if the oil pastel is going to move if it has that much heat. So it had enough heat that it was melted because I was able to remove it. But then I thought, well, maybe it just wasn't hot enough to start running. So then I got out my big Mama Jamba, like this scary heat gun that's specifically for melting wax and things like plastic, and you can buy acrylic plastics and you can heat it up with this heat gun and then bend them, and it's really cool. It's a great heat gun. It's totally worth the money that I paid for it. But that still didn't work. So then I thought, well, it's already warm. What if I put it on my under paper and I smush it around? Because that's really kind of the idea I was going for. I wanted it to be runny and kind of smushed around, not like scribbled areas. So that's what I did. I flipped it over and I smushed it because it wasn't working. I couldn't get the heat guns to make the oil pastel do what I wanted. So then I flipped it over and I smushed it right into my under paper, and it looks cool. It's not the technique I was going for. It's never a technique that I would say, oh, look at how cool this smush technique is. That's not really like a fabulous title. I don't know what I should call it, but it's fine. So I have this cool background to work with, and then I thought, well, maybe I want some like big, bold, whatever type or numbers, and I have this Tim Holtz tissue wrap from the other tag, the yellow one that I did, and I thought, well, what if I heat up the oil pastel, and then I put the tissue wrap down on it, and maybe the oil pastel will soak through. But because I had smushed a bunch of the oil pastel out onto to my underpaper, there wasn't really enough of it to soak through the tissue wrap. Plus, tissue wrap is not like tissue paper. Like, it's thicker and has a different coating. So I think that that plays a big part in getting it to embed in things. And I'm going to keep that in mind for the future, because now I've sort of had an issue with it twice. Not that it's a fabulous product and I love using it, but it just wasn't really hitting the spot. But I still wanted something black, so I dug through my stencils, and I had this face stencil by Donna. And it's really cool, and I thought, well, I haven't used distress inks over oil pastels yet, so let's see what we can do. So, so I meant to grab my distress inks, but that's not what I got out. I ended up, because this is a DIY fill pad, I ended up getting out my archival ink rather than my distress ink. So that's all right, no problem. So at that point, when I realized what I had done, I was already kind of too far gone. Then I decided that I would get out some embossing powder, because this looks really cool, but I wanted it to be a lot darker and like more intense, especially next to that really beautiful green that was happening. So then I got out my distress embossing powder, and I don't know if they even really make these anymore, but they are really cool. So the distress embossing powders are like rocky, they're gravelly, and once you heat them, then you can kind of scrape away some of these little crystals, and it leaves kind of like holes. And then because it's distress embossing powder, it has a lot of texture to it, and it's very grungy and kind of reminds me of like a really fine sand after it's been embossed, rather than that like smooth finish that you get from a normal embossing powder. So it's really cool. So I just spread it all over the archival ink, because I at this point had realized that it was archival ink. And I wanted it to be darker, and I got out the distress embossing powder, and now I'm just going to heat that up. And this is not really something you can see very well in person, let alone on camera, but the distress embossing powder does melt similarly to embossing powder. You heat it, and it melts up, and then it cures, and the little crystals will cure together and then adhere or cure to your paper in the background. I do have an oil pastel base, so I'm not sure if that affected this at all, but it seemed like there are certain crystals in the embossing powder that are meant to resist and melting, and then when you like burnish it, those come off and leave behind like kind of like little holes or divots in your embossing powder. So it worked really well on the oil pastel, and I'm not sure if that's because it's oil pastel and the embossing powder wasn't really melting to it, but none of my other areas of embossing powder came up. So it seemed to work really well. So I embossed on top of the oil pastels, and that was pretty cool. And then I'm just going to finish off with some white embellishing. Like, I'm going to do some doodles. I'm going to put the circle, and I'll doodle the lips and then around the side of the face. And with a white Sharpie, and it's water-based, so I kind of have to keep an eye on that. But there that goes, and that finishes off this tag. So the acrylic pour technique idea, like faux look, did not work out, but I still came out with a cool tag, a smush technique, if you will. Check out what the other artists have done using products from DonnaDowneyStudios.com from the shop. It's awesome. Thank you so much for being here. This is the 5th video in this series, so if by chance you missed the others, find those. Check those out, because I've done some fun stuff with Craypaw Oil Pastels by Sakura of America. I have a second series that's all about using art rollers to create a series of canvases, miniature canvases. And find me, wherever you're seeing this, find me, subscribe to my channel. I'll be glad to have you along. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know if you have any questions. Bye.